right, welcome back everybody to the second panel, the panel's title is, and I think it's a wonderful title, thank you Anne, is America as a Work in Progress, right? And so we have four very interesting papers, and we will go in the order as we see in the program. So first up, Anthony Colliver. Justice Holmes and the redefinition of speech. One more thing, we will, as Professor Bauer did in the last panel, we'll wait for questions at the end of the panel. Okay, so Anthony, you're up.
The United States government was afraid of foreign espionage and dissent during World War I. Legislation was enacted to suppress those fears, but the same legislation attacked the civil liberties granted by the Constitution. Jacob Abrams and Charles Schenck were two men who violated the Sedition and the Espionage Acts. Each case was unique, but both attempted to define free speech during the World War I era. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. played a key role during these hearings. In the first case before the court, Holmes ruled in favor of restricting the freedom of speech. Months later, in the Abrams case, Holmes switched his opinion. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. shaped the vision of free speech in America by shifting his opinions in Schenck and Abrams cases and creating a precedent for speech both during peace and in wartime. The judicial application Holmes brought to the court was shaped by his interest in philosophy and thought. The philosophical skepticism in his decision was the role he applied to the bench. The destiny of man, and not the evanescent events of the day, preoccupied his mind. He questioned things, all things, and derived answers quickly based upon the truths of philosophy. He was led by the divination of a philosopher and the imagination of a poet. Justice Holmes believed in the sacrifice of one individual for the good of the society. If the majority was in favor of something, Holmes was willing to stand on those grounds, but they must not violate the Constitution. If my fellow citizen wants to go to hell, says Holmes, I will help them get there. Judging on idealism was not his responsibility. Rather, he upheld the desires of the people within the confines of the Constitution. One of the roles Holmes would play in deciding the desires of the people would be the constitutionality of the Espionage and the Sedition Acts. The acts explicitly stated the ability of the government officials to abridge certain rights. The Espionage Acts in 1917 allowed for postal officials to ban newspaper and magazines. The further amended act in the form of the Sedition Act made it a federal offense to use disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about anything relating to America or American government. This is in direct contrast to the language of the First Amendment stating, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. These were the confines in which Holmes had to interpret the constitutional legality of the Schenck and the Abrams cases. Charles Schenck worked as a secretary for the Philadelphia Socialist Party. The organization encouraged citizens to oppose the draft. They compared the draft to slavery and claimed it was a violation of the 13th Amendment. They believed a conscript is little better than a convict. Leaflets were published by the group stating, "Long live the Constitution of the United States and assert your rights." The group, according to minutes seized by federal agents, had planned to produce upwards of 15,000 leaflets. They were to be distributed with the intention of obstructing draft and war procedures. In doing so, they would be in violation of the Espionage Act. These leaflets encouraged draftees to register as conscientious objectors. It stated that if you do not assert and support your rights, you are helping to deny and disparage rights, which it is the solemn duty of all citizens and residents of the United States to retain. This publication of leaflets was a violation of the Espionage Act according to Schenck v. the United States because it attempted to cause insubordination and to obstruct the recruitment and enlistment of the United States. In spite of this, the court recognized the legality of speech of the leaflets in peacetime. They said, "We admit in many places in the ordinary times the defendants in saying all that was said in the circular would have been within their constitutional rights. This shows the lack of perpetual continuity of the First Amendment. The court, specifically Holmes, is saying depending on the situation within the country, speech may be abridged." Holmes also argues about a differing variable which abridges the length speech can carry without becoming a violation, which is when the country is at war. In Schenck, Holmes does not guarantee unlimited access to speech in wartime. He says, when a nation is at war, many things that might be said in times of peace are such a hindrance to its efforts that the utterances will not be endured. This shows speech can take on stronger significance in certain times and less in others. Speech is not perpetual, according to the court. The court's opinion continued. Holmes, at this point, offered one of his most memorable lines throughout his time on the bench of the Supreme Court. The statement is used as a way of teaching the limits of speech today. He says, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic." Holmes is saying speech is not uninhibited. There are certain situations in which people may be endangered by inciting fear within a group on false pretenses. It is one of the limitations of speech the court defined in the Schenck case. The precedent the Supreme Court set is a clear and present danger test. Holmes says, "The question in every case is whether the words are used in circumstances and are of such a nature to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. It is a question of proximity and degree. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in times of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterances will not be endured so long as men fight, and no court could regard them as protected by constitutional right." This test is broad in scope. It does not define what is a clear and present danger. Rather, it is open to interpretation for future judges on a case-by-case basis. In this situation, the danger is obstructing war activities. In the summer of 1919, Justice Holmes intended to retreat to his summer residence in Massachusetts and read some of his favorite classical works. In July, Holmes was introduced to Mr. Zechariah Chafee. In June, Chafee wrote an article for the New Republic denouncing the opinion of Holmes and his interpretation of free speech cases in regards to the Espionage and the Sedition Acts. His article laid out how speech should rarely, if ever, be inhibited. Chafee discusses the Espionage and Sedition Acts and Holmes' failure to fully explain the limits and confines of speech. He thought Holmes was too vague. Chafee says even in times of war, speech should be unrestricted by the censorship or by punishment. Speech, also argued Holmes' opinion, neglected to insert a key concept to fully interpret a clear and present danger. This was the social interest behind free speech. Ideas were to be spread freely unless they posed an inherent danger. The purpose of society and government is the discovery and the spread of truth. Chafee left the meeting in Cambridge feeling he did not convince Holmes of these ideas. But as Chafee would see months later in the Abrams case, he had left a much greater impact than he had thought. Jacob Abrams was an immigrant from Russia and held anarchist and pacifist beliefs. His beliefs fermented and manifested at the origin of World War I when he published pamphlets opposing President Wilson and the United States foreign policy. These reactionary laws passed by Congress affected Abrams and led to his arrest. His actions were in violation of the Sedition Act of 1918. Abrams was fully opposed to the United States entry into World War I and the attempt to suppress the 1917 Russian Revolution. He printed 2 separate leaflets denouncing the war efforts and President Woodrow Wilson. The leaflets were intended to be distributed in August of 1918 and dropped from a New York City window. Of the 2 different leaflets, one was written in Yiddish. This would allow for a wider variety of viewership, especially among the intending class of people who were the Russian immigrant. One of the main arguments was that the Russian immigrants working in munitions factories were in reality producing munitions intended for their fellow Russians at home. In Yiddish, it says, "They will make bullets not only for the Germans, but for the workers of Soviet Russia." The leaflet argues to stop lending money in the form of war bonds and stop working in factories. Holmes wrote the dissenting opinion for the court. The first point to the dissent is to proclaim the insignificance of what Abrams and his comrades did. Secondly, and more importantly, Holmes redefined speech, and this is what Chafee had argued for. Holmes defends Abrams in the case and does not prosecute him. He cannot find areas where the violations are occurring in a manner that deserves prosecution. He disregarded the literature as silly leaflets, which did not pose a threat. On top of that, they were produced by an unknown man whose opinions would not cause an immediate danger for the success of government. With the statements, Holmes is backpedaling on what his previous thoughts were in the Schenck case, and does not see a clear black and white violation of speech. Holmes creates new precedents in his opinions. The most significant precedent for speech is the marketplace of ideas. Holmes developed this in his conversation with Chafee. He says, "The ultimate good desired is better reached by the free trade of ideas. For a society to grow, new ideas have to take root. When the government influences this exchange, the ultimate good is less than what it could be." This is where the market competition enters into Holmes' opinion. The test of truth, says Holmes, is the power of thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. The changing of the guard from the clear and present danger test and shank to an imminent danger is a beautifully crafted argument. Holmes gives a multitude of reasons for the expansion of speech rights in the nation. He specifies the Constitution does not permit limiting speech in this facet, only if it will bring about forthwith certain substantive evils that the United States constitutionally may seek to prevent. He also elaborates that powers become stronger in times of war. This does not mean speech is fully abridged, but the fire test is applied, but the danger must be imminent. In the Abrams case, Holmes redefines the concept of freedom of speech. He changed the reading of a clear and present danger to an imminent danger. This case fully displays the legal grandeur of Holmes, and he shifts his standing, maintains certain ideals, and yet broadens the scope in which his contemporaries would be content. The philosophical education and thought Holmes applied to his work on the bench was fully utilized during his opinion in Abrams. Through Holmes's wit and determination, he shifts the opinions in Schenck from a narrow view of speech to broadening the application in Abrams. He shifts from the majority opinion in Schenck to the minority opinion in Abrams, and in doing this, set the precedent for speech in both times of peace and in times of war. Thank you.
All right, Kevin Smith is our second paper today. The title is Defending an Uncommonly Silly Law. So take it away, Kevin.
In 1879, Connecticut passed a law forbidding the use of contraceptive devices. From 1917 until it was overturned by the Supreme Court case Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965, over 31 attempts were made to either add a health exception to or repeal the law, but to no avail. This is rather surprising, considering how weird the law seems to the modern reader, and the fact that even Justice Stewart, a defender of its constitutionality, believed it was an uncommonly silly law. Despite its uncommonly silly reputation, many educated people supported this law, both in Connecticut's legislature and the courts. In this paper, I will argue that while the state's supporters in the legislature focus on how contraceptives were themselves against natural law, by the time Griswold went before the Supreme Court, legal support focused more on judicial restraint than the wisdom of the law itself. State and federal laws restricting access to contraceptives and other obscenities were often called Comstock laws, named after Anthony Comstock, a major lobbyist for such legislation at the federal level. When Griswold went before the Supreme Court, 30 other states had their own laws against the sale or possession of contraceptives. What made Connecticut's law unique was that it forbade the very use of contraceptives, not just their possession or sale. Because of the difficulties with proving that someone was using or had used contraceptives, the law was primarily enforced through the accessories clause by preventing the establishment of birth control clinics or closing them after they had been opened. In Connecticut, many reasons for birth control legislation focus on the concept of natural law. The natural law tradition in ethics and political philosophy goes back to the ancient Greeks and continues most prominently in the ethical teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. The doctrine of natural law, put simply, states that human nature, or what kind of things humans are, determines what behavior is morally right and wrong. Even though many involved in this movement, including those who worked to get Connecticut's law passed in the first place were Protestants, by the 1920s, most offenders of the statute were Roman Catholics who thought contraception violated natural law. In 1965, the year oral arguments went before the Supreme Court for Griswold v. Connecticut, the most recent and influential document explaining the Catholic Church's opposition to contraception was Pope Pius XI's papal encyclical titled On Christian Marriage. This encyclical said, since the conjugal act is destined primarily by nature for the begetting of children, those who, in exercising it, deliberately frustrate its natural power and purpose, sin against nature and commit a deed which is shameful and intrinsically vicious. With this understanding of contraceptives as a sin against nature, and abstinence as the only moral method of birth control, priests and lay people testified in support of Connecticut's birth control law in the early 20th century. Two such lay people who used natural law theory to support the Connecticut statute were Mrs. Louise Fisher and Dr. David A. Fox. According to the historian John W. Johnson, Mrs. Fisher, a representative of the Connecticut Council of Catholic Women, was typical of the Catholic interest groups arguing against amending the Connecticut law. When she opposed repealing it in 1925, she said repealing the law would increase the trend toward evading the responsibilities on the part of married women. Caring for their children is one of the main responsibilities of a married woman, and if she were allowed to use contraceptives to avoid having them, she would be more likely to abandon her other responsibilities. Similarly, Dr. Fox, in his 1931 testimony, thought that legalizing contraceptives would send the message to children that sex was about pleasure and not primarily about procreation. Such an argument could have force only if Dr. Fox and his audience shared the assumptions of natural law that treating a secondary purpose as primary was wrong. It should be pointed out that just because the Roman Catholic Church thought that it was immoral to use contraceptives, that did not mean Catholics were obligated to believe it should be illegal. Some Catholics, like John E. Dunsford, a law professor at St. Louis University, thought the law had become curiously outdated as social attitudes and opinions had changed since the law was originally passed in 1879. He thought that since the law was habitually evaded, it ran the risk of breeding contempt for the law, for the legal structure itself. By the time Griswold went to trial, many priests were also tired of campaigning for such a poorly enforced law year after year. In 1969, Boston's Archbishop finally said the Catholic Church would no longer actively support laws against the use of contraceptives. Despite this change in opinion, Connecticut chose to defend its law all the way to the Supreme Court. The legal challenge that was ultimately successful was Griswold v. Connecticut. Griswold started in 1961 when Drs. Charles Lee Buxton and Mrs. Estelle T. Griswold were arrested for running a birth control clinic in New Haven, Connecticut. Buxton and Griswold knew the clinic was illegal under the Accessories Clause, but they and other members of the Planned Parenthood League of Connecticut wanted to challenge the constitutionality of Connecticut's birth control law. As was expected, the Connecticut Supreme Court of Errors upheld the law. However, their arguments were more successful in the Supreme Court. In defense of Connecticut's birth control law, Joseph P. Clark, the attorney for the state of Connecticut, put forward two kinds of arguments. The first kind said that the law was a legitimate expression of the state's police power. Clark claimed Connecticut's birth control statute was legitimate because it allowed the state to better enforce its laws against fornication and adultery. By not letting even married couples use them, the state was preventing contraceptives from getting into the wrong hands. Since the fear of having an illegitimate pregnancy prevented people from breaking other sex laws, Connecticut's birth control law was a legitimate expression of the state's police power. Clark's justification can best be understood as a kind of precursor to modern gun control laws. In the same way that people do not think it is immoral to own an assault rifle per se, Clark claimed that using contraceptives was not immoral on its own. Instead, both supporters of gun control laws and Clark said that having these products out in the market was not worth the risk of these products being used for an immoral purpose. This indirect kind of justification allowed him to ground his argument on laws against fornication and adultery that almost everyone at the time thought were legitimate. The second kind of argument Clark used focused on how the law did not violate the appellant's rights. He first points out that according to a more traditional understanding of privacy, no one's privacy had actually been violated because the patients had provided the testimony voluntarily. According to this understanding of privacy, privacy can only be violated if the evidence had been collected in some illegal way, and since this did not happen, the rights were not violated. He also said that it did not violate the appellant's rights because there are other perfectly legal birth control options available for people. Just because using an article as contraceptive was illegal, this did not mean that married people may not practice birth control. Since people can use abstinence, withdrawal, and the rhythm method as birth control, Connecticut did not limit their behavior in an unreasonable degree. After reading their briefs and listening to oral arguments, the United States Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of Griswold and Buxton, 7-2. In the majority opinion written by Justice Douglas, the court agreed with the appellants and said that Connecticut's law against the use of contraception violated the right to marital privacy, which is within the penumbra of specific guarantees of the Bill of Rights. According to Douglas, specific guarantees in the Bill of Rights have penumbras formed by emanations from those guarantees that help give them life and substance. In other words, certain amendments extend beyond what they explicitly mention to protect similar rights. Connecticut's birth control law invades this right to privacy by trying to regulate the actual intimate relations between a husband and wife, which is repulsive to the notions of privacy surrounding the marriage relationship. In their dissenting opinions, Justices Black and Stewart strongly disagreed with the majority's opinion that a general right to privacy was in the Constitution. Both justices pointed out that they did not side with the state of Connecticut because they thought the law was wise. However, they did believe it was constitutional. Justice Black agreed that certain amendments protect privacy under particular circumstances, but this does not mean there is a general right to privacy. For example, he agreed that the Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizure, but it belittles the amendment to talk about it as though it protects nothing but privacy. He feared that if we change what the amendments actually say to something more flexible like privacy, this would allow judges to determine what is constitutional based on what kind of laws they prefer, and not based on what the Constitution actually says. In the aftermath of Griswold v. Connecticut, the majority of people who did not agree with the ruling did so for almost the same reasons as Justices Black and Stewart. These legal scholars agreed that the majority opinion was an overextension of the court's power and sloppy legal reasoning. However, this minimalist defense of Connecticut's birth control law was a far cry from the impassioned arguments of Anthony Comstock in the 1870s. While arguments for the law in Connecticut's legislature were fierce attacks against the evils of contraception, when the state had to take a case to the Supreme Court challenging their law, it understood the law as a helpful way to prevent other sex crimes and not a moral evil itself. Such a change in argumentative style would be repeated in later controversial Supreme cases for decades to come, long after the wider public forgot about Connecticut's uncommonly silly law. Thank you.
Okay, Michael Garrido, Confronting Presidential Power, U.S. v. Nixon, 1974. Take it away, Michael.
The Watergate scandal started when 5 burglars were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee. The investigation that followed eventually implicated President Richard Nixon. His accomplices often cooperated with authorities, revealing many of the secrets Nixon tried to hide. In 1973, the existence of the Nixon tapes, secret audio recordings of conversations between the president and his staff, were made public. Congress demanded the release of the tapes, but Nixon claimed executive privilege prevented that action. The legal battle that developed over the tapes tested the doctrine of the separation of powers established in the U.S. Constitution. The issue of whether or not Nixon was legally required to release the tapes led to a constitutional crisis. It was this crisis that the Supreme Court had to resolve in the case U.S. v. Nixon of 1974. The resulting precedents has made the case one of the most important in modern U.S. history. Watergate began with the break-in in June of 1972. The burglars were quickly linked to a White House employee. One of the burglars was even employed by the Committee for the Re-election of the President, or CREEP as it is sometimes called. The connections created immediate concerns in Nixon's administration. The aforementioned Nixon tapes recorded multiple meetings between Nixon and his aides, held just days after the arrests were made. Nixon's effort to cover up the scandal was clearly recorded on June 23, 1972, on what was later dubbed the smoking gun tape. During the conversations, Nixon conspired to have the CIA tell the FBI that the break-in was a secret U.S. operation. Nixon thought that if the break-in could be tied to matters of national security, the FBI would willingly halt the investigation. The break-in had been political. Motivated by the 1972 presidential election, CREEP used dirty tricks while spying on the DNC to help Nixon win re-election. The first Watergate trial began in January of 1973 after the election. Only 2 burglars pled not guilty, while the rest eventually pled guilty. The judge who presided over the trial, John Sirica, was suspicious that the defendants who had pled guilty had done so in cooperation with a cover-up. He was not alone in his concern. In February, the Senate voted 70-0 to set up a committee to investigate the 1972 presidential election. The committee was chaired by Senator Sam J. Ervin. The Ervin Committee and Judge Sirica's judicial actions became the most effective efforts in discovering the truth behind the break-in. At the sentencing, one of the burglars gave Sirica a letter claiming the defendants were participants in a cover-up to hide the truth behind Watergate. In April, Nixon announced the resignation of his closest aides who had been accomplices in the scandal up to that point. During the same announcement, Nixon denied any previous knowledge of the break-in or the cover-up. In May, the Ervin Committee began its investigation into the scandal. Soon after, Archibald Cox was assigned to conduct a special investigation into all aspects of the scandal. But in July, when White House aide Alexander Butterfield was questioned by the Irvin Committee, a major break occurred in the investigation. During Butterfield's now famous testimony, he accidentally revealed the existence of the taping system in the White House Oval Office. Cox quickly filed a subpoena requesting some of the tapes. Nixon refused to hand them over, claiming that his private conversations were protected under executive privilege. In August, Judge Sirica ruled that Nixon was required to cooperate with Cox. Nixon appealed, and in October, Judge Sirica's ruling was upheld. This judicial defeat led to what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. After the courts upheld Cox's subpoena, Nixon had Cox fired. On the night of Saturday, October 20th, it was announced that the Attorney General, along with the Deputy Attorney General, had resigned. Solicitor General Robert Bork had fired Cox and kept his own job. After the massacre, pressure to release the tapes began to build more rapidly. On October 23rd, Nixon agreed to release the tapes originally requested by Cox. He also agreed to appoint a new special prosecutor. Leon Jaworski was selected soon after. It was also during this time that the House of Representatives first discussed the possibility of impeachment. Then, on March 1st, 1974, the federal grand jury investigating Watergate indicted 7 former members of the White House staff on charges of conspiracy, false declaration, obstruction of justice, and perjury. Nixon was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the cover-up. Jaworski soon subpoenaed a second group of tapes, which led to another showdown with Nixon. But this time, the House Judiciary Committee, considering impeachment, also voted to subpoena the tapes. Nixon had until April 30th to hand them over. Throughout the investigation, Nixon contested that executive privilege prevented him complying with the subpoenas because matters of national security could be revealed in the tapes. Judge Sirica proposed that Nixon hand the tapes over directly to him so that he could review the tapes in his chambers. Nixon's reply to the judge's suggestion was that executive privilege was absolute and not subject to any form of judicial review. It was at this point that both parties came to the final impasse. On May 1st, James St. Clair, Nixon's attorney in the case, petitioned Judge Sirica to quash Jaworski's subpoena. He also announced that no tapes would be handed over to the House. On May 20th, Judge Sirica decided not to quash Jaworski's subpoena. This was followed by another subpoena for the tapes from the House on May 30th. The issue had reached a constitutional crisis. The president was refusing to comply with the courts or Congress. Since Nixon would not comply with Judge Sirica's decision, Jaworski appealed to the Supreme Court, who agreed to hear the case. The case U.S. v. Nixon was heard by the Supreme Court in July of 1974. During the trial, St. Clair presented the president's claims that he did not have to comply with Judge Sirica's order to release the tapes, as well as Nixon's claim that the court had no jurisdiction in the matter. Jaworski was again seeking to have his subpoena upheld. The Supreme Court was led by Chief Justice Warren Burger. Justice Rehnquist recused himself, leaving the decision up to the remaining 8 justices. All 8 justices ruled unanimously in support of the opinion written by Chief Justice Burger. The opinion was delivered on July 24th. In the opinion, the court addressed the president's claim that, quote, the separation of powers doctrine precludes judicial review of a president's claim of privilege, end quote. The court continued to summarize the president's claim, writing, quote, if he, Nixon, does not prevail on the claim of absolute privilege, the court should hold as a matter of constitutional law that the privilege prevails over the subpoena. Nixon believed that the executive privilege was an absolute privilege. The court was stating that even if executive privilege was not determined to be absolute, Nixon wanted the court to rule that the Constitution from which executive privilege is derived trumped the subpoena, but the court did not agree with Nixon. The court invoked the precedents of judicial review established in Marbury v. Madison. Chief Justice Burger wrote, quote, if the province and duty of this court to say what the law is with respect to the claim of privilege presented in this case. The court denied Nixon's claim of absolute executive privilege. Instead, the court explained why executive privilege was not absolute. Nixon had claimed that the doctrine of separation of powers granted him absolute executive privilege, but the court determined, quote, neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the need for confidentiality of high-level communications without more can sustain an absolute, unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. End quote. The court not only rejected the president's claim of absolute privilege, but also specified the superiority of the needs of the judicial process over the need for presidential discretion. The court clearly defined when such privilege did exist, when there was a, quote, need to protect military, diplomatic, or sensitive national security interests. But the court also found that Judge Sirica would have been able to review the tapes privately to determine if the concern for executive privilege existed. The court established that such an inspection would have afforded Nixon all the privilege needed given the situation. In its conclusion, the Supreme Court affirmed the decision that the tapes be handed over to the prosecution. This was the end of Nixon's legal claim of executive privilege as a means of keeping the tapes from Congress. According to the court, the president was required to comply with Sirica's order to release the tapes. At that time, the House began passing articles of impeachment. Nixon faced a difficult situation. As he saw it, he could, quote, resign or be impeached. The smoking gun recording was one of the tapes being subpoenaed, and Nixon knew once the conversation was discovered, impeachment and conviction were assured. With this knowledge, Nixon released a transcript of the conversation to the press on August 5th. The next day, Nixon made his decision to resign before he could be impeached. He announced his resignation 3 days later. This dramatic conclusion was a result of the Supreme Court's decision that Nixon had to comply with subpoenas to release the tapes. He then released the information that he knew would be most damaging to himself. This is almost surprising considering his refusal to comply up to that point. U.S. v. Nixon was a test of the doctrine of separation of powers. Nixon had claimed that the courts had no authority to review his claims of executive privilege, but the Supreme Court ruled otherwise. In doing so, the court found that Nixon's claim of absolute privilege was misconstrued. If Nixon had wished to continue his original course, he could have challenged the Supreme Court's decision by continuing to withhold the tapes. This would have no doubt led to an impeachment, but another consequence would have also occurred. By taking such an action, Nixon would have undermined the authority of the Supreme Court and the power of the Constitution as the court had interpreted it. But he did not. Instead, he acknowledged the ruling as constitutional by releasing the transcript of the smoking gun tape. With this, he confirmed that the Supreme Court and the Constitution determine the law of America, not the president. The Supreme Court's verdict declared the supremacy of the Constitution, not the president. The court's verdict in U.S. v. Nixon set an important legal precedent which every future commander-in-chief must consider before attempting to abuse their power.
Our final paper for the panel is by Jordan Mazurek, and it's called The Love Canal Disaster.
Love Canal is an infamous Niagara Falls neighborhood that was built on top of a toxic waste site and resulted in serious health concerns for the residents who lived in the area in the late 1970s. The spike of miscarriages and outbreak of unexplainable diseases from residents eventually led to political activism throughout New York. The end goal for these protests was to be permanently relocated to a new location and for the Love Canal neighborhood to be deemed uninhabitable. They found a moral high ground which developed in conflict from exceeding drastic measures over time. There were public showdowns at school board meetings which ended in screaming matches against public officials and public backlash from holding EPA members hostage. Through more recent environmental tragedies like the 2014 Flint, Michigan water crisis, it is clear that the United States continues to put environmental issues to the side. The case of Love Canal reveals that activists had the most success by coming together as a community to gain public attention, which is similar to future environmental tragedies like the Flint water crisis. The Love Canal tragedy began in 1892 when a businessman named William T. Love proposed his plan to create a model city. Love's plan was to dig a 7-foot wide canal which would connect the upper and lower Niagara River. Love was planning to utilize the water to provide a cheap source of power for the Niagara Falls area. While this canal would benefit the residents of the area by providing parks, community centers, and neighborhoods, it would eventually make William Love a huge profit. Due to unfortunate circumstances, this canal was abandoned because Love ran out of money for his project. By 1910, William Love's dream was shattered and all that was left was the remains, a partial ditch. For 10 years, the canal was filled by rainwater and remained untouched until Hooker Chemical Company stepped in. Hooker Chemical was a company that produced synthetic rubber which contains myrcetin, a sulfur compound. For over 10 years, Hooker Chemical Company was dumping hazardous waste into this former abandoned trench. By 1953, the owners and operators of Hooker covered this mess with dirt and sold the land back to the city of Niagara Falls for $1. The city of Niagara Falls began building 800 private single-family houses, 240 low-income apartments, and a public elementary school, the 99th Street Elementary School. From the years 1975 to 1976, the state of New York received an unusual amount of heavy snowfall, which resulted in the chemicals buried in the ground to form into puddles and ooze into the basement of these homes. This was the start of various unexplainable health problems occurring at Love Canal. By the end of this disaster, it was revealed by journalists that Hooker Chemical Company had dumped at least 12 known carcinogens, cancer-causing chemicals, inside of this trench. Barbara Quimby, who attended the 99th Street Elementary School, said one of her friends who was 7 years old had died from leukemia. Students who attended the school stated they would get burns on their feet from walking barefoot on the blacktop. Hooker Chemical Company admitted in their lawsuit United States versus Hooker Chemicals and Plastic Corporation to burying around 21,000 tons of various chemicals in the canal. There were many air, soil, and water tests that found chemicals throughout a 10-block radius. But further tests proved that individuals who were 13 miles away experienced many health problems. While Hooker admitted to there being over 21,000 tons of chemicals being in the Love Canal, the complete list of compounds that were discarded there is still unknown. Lois Marie Gibbs was a Love Canal resident who was the main person responsible for raising awareness about this environmental disaster. Michael Gibbs, Lois Gibbs' son, had many illnesses which were the beginning of a series of protests throughout Love Canal. Michael did not have any health problems before moving into their house on Pine Avenue. After living in their home for a few years, he had developed many unexplainable illnesses. These health problems range in a variety from liver problems, urinary tract disorders, asthma, and epilepsy. When Gibbs took her son to the doctor, these physicians could not explain what was causing her son's illnesses. Gibbs began to research more on what could have caused her son to be sick, which led her to find out about the chemicals that were underneath the 99th Street Elementary School. Since Michael was very sick and was beginning to attend that school daily, she became desperate and sought to send him to a different school. She spoke to the Niagara Falls School Board superintendent, and they denied her request to move Michael. They stated that if they had to move one student, they must move all their students and close the school. The Niagara Falls School Board was looking at what was economically feasible rather than the safety of their children. The school board denial of moving Michael only drove Gibbs' motivation to raise awareness. She began to go door to door to discuss her son's illnesses and offer information about the chemicals that were located in the Love Canal. Each person she approached agreed that there was something awful going on that caused many health problems within their families. Through door-to-door campaigning, Lois Gibbs and many other Love Canal residents began petitioning to close the school. Similar to how they reacted to Michael Gibbs, the Niagara Falls School Board was not willing to relocate the children and close the school. Gibbs and residents refused to give up until this community was shut down. Like many other cases of activism, one leader could be responsible for an entire community chanting and cursing at meetings with state officials. They began to threaten officials by holding them hostage, and there was a burning effigy of Governor Hugh Carey due to his lack of sympathy for the community. This community identified a problem and was not willing to give up until they got their justice. The city of Niagara Falls became involved as activists began to make phone calls about their children's illnesses. Hugh Carey, the governor of New York at the time, wanted to relocate these families temporarily until further investigation was done. Due to reports of high incidence of miscarriages and birth-defected children in August of 1978, the New York State Department of Health became involved and demanded temporary relocation for all pregnant women and children under the age of 2. While Carey recognized these severe health concerns, it was questionable to see how serious he was about acting on it. Eventually, scientists from the Environmental Protection Agency began to investigate what chemicals were buried underneath this community. Through major construction, chemicals were being brought up into the air, and many residents claimed that they could now smell the chemicals. Many residents were concerned of their children who were older than the age of 2, as their brains were still sensitive to development. 239 families were studied by the New York Department of State, and they each noted birth defects amongst children and miscarriages in women. Eventually, Governor Carey had permanently relocated these families and purchased their home at replacement value, but it was only for families with pregnant women or children under the age of 2. There were still other families who were trapped in the area. After Carey had advised for relocation, there was a 7-foot-high barbed wire fence that was installed all around the area that stated, "Danger, hazardous area, unauthorized personnel, keep out." This started riots in the streets, which resulted in many individuals chanting, "We want out." Many people were beginning to experience psychological suffering due to Love Canal. One man had hung himself in his room at the motel he was relocated at, and another resident had jumped off the Rainbow Bridge in Niagara Falls. Gibson residents saw an opportunity for change when 2 EPA scientists came to Love Canal to investigate the area. Lois Gibbs had prior standoffs with President Carter's administration, as they refused to show concern at Love Canal. Fed up and furious, Gibbs ordered for people to hold these EPA officials hostage by boarding the door up with their bodies so that they could not get out of the house. This was eventually what caused President Carter to take concern, and after a 5-year fight, a national health emergency was declared on Love Canal. This health emergency allowed 810 families temporary relocation out of the neighborhood. By October 1980, President Carter signed a bill which evacuated all of these families permanently from the Love Canal. While there had been reports of adverse pregnancies, chromosome damage, and high chemical exposure, the real reason Carter had signed the bill was because of mental agony. The media's coverage devastated viewers watching, and Carter had little choice but to comply to the residents' demands. It was nearly 14 years after Carter's public health emergency that the residents received any financial compensation for the physical, mental, and emotional trauma that they endured. The state of New York was initially going to sue Hooker Chemical Company for $150 million, but they settled on $98 million to clean up the area. Though this money initially provided a solution, scientists have since stated that the Love Canal will be uninhabitable for decades. The Love Canal tragedy will remain the most publicized United States environmental tragedy in history. Many individuals can argue that the awareness at Love Canal sparked a national concern for environmental issues. Instead of putting money towards safe disposal methods, it seems that the United States government focuses more on what will make them a bigger profit. There are many environmental tragedies that have occurred that are not at all similar to Love Canal, but the government has reacted to them in the same way. In response to the crisis, activists have also come together to succeed their goal. The Flint, Michigan water crisis occurred in 2014, and this city's water still remains unfit for consumption. This crisis began when the source for drinking water changed from Lake Huron and the Detroit River to the Flint River. The lead pipes that were used for access to the Flint River caused lead to seep into Flint's drinking water. While this first occurred in 2014, a federal emergency was not declared until 2016. It has been stated that the city of Flint will not have clean water until all the lead pipes at the Flint River are replaced, which will not be finished until 2020. Similar to Love Canal, this crisis was tended to slowly when it should be at highest concerns. It took residents at Love Canal 5 years to be evacuated, as in Flint it will take them 6 years to have lead-free water. While there were activists at Love Canal, many Michigan residents acted similarly in order to get what they desired. On April 12, 2018, various protesters from Flint converged at the state capitol building in Lansing after their governor, Rick Snyder, closed Flint's remaining free bottled water sites. Flint residents coming together as a community is very similar to what happened at Love Canal. The environmental activists at both Love Canal and Flint, Michigan found themselves stymied by how long it took for the government to comply with their demands, yet saw success by coming together as a community to achieve justice.
Well, thank you very much to our 4 panelists. And now we'll open it up for some questions.
Can you project? I'm just kidding. You're entitled to the microphone later.
Well, thanks for those really interesting papers. One thing that struck me in Jordan's paper was in the Love Canal case, public opinion seemed to make a big difference. And so I had a couple of questions related to that. I was curious, all the other papers dealt with these legal proceedings and these court cases. Do you think that public opinion came to play in those? And I don't know, Jordan, if you think the Flint issue is public opinion, is it making a difference in that one?
I think that for these certain issues, because for environmental, it's not that they haven't received, they haven't recognized what's happening, it's that it's being tended to so slowly, and that it happened in 2014 and it's still they're not gonna have clean water until 2020, and it seems like in certain issues like this, when it's the public, that it's tended to rather slowly, rather than the other papers, it seems like that's on the highest agenda.
For the Watergate scandal, I would say public opinion maybe followed the investigation. There was apathy, I'd say, at the beginning when there was suspicions over whether the scandal was even a scandal. And it was actually the determination of a lot of individuals, such as reporters, who continued to investigate the scandal after others had dismissed it. And so the public opinion mattered, but there was already evidence of the scandal by the time the public had caught on to how serious the problem was. So I would say that, if anything, the public opinion mattered more once the scandal was out in the open, and there was a heavy desire to have the scandal finished, to get on with it.
No, I think it mattered in the sense that it changed people's minds on basically everyone's opinion on contraception, because prior to 1930, when the Anglican Church said contraception was okay, all other major Christian denominations said it was wrong. And so I think once that changed, everyone sort of just slowly started to think that this law was kind of weird. And I think eventually the Supreme Court just said that it was time to move on.
In the case of my paper, it was more peers and contemporaries influencing Holmes in his decision. He really was sensitive towards the what the younger people in law school thought of him and his opinions. So whenever they were against what he decided in Schenck, that influenced him in his Abrams decision. And that's why the summer meeting up in Massachusetts was very important and influential to him.
Okay, for Anthony and Michael on this one, do you think time of war allows presidential authority over the Constitution?
I can start if you want. I would say that as far as this specific situation, considering executive privilege, there's actually a point where the Supreme Court did set aside matters of military concern as being covered under executive privilege. So I would say, at least in the case of my Supreme Court case, the times of war are times when I wouldn't necessarily say that the president is given powers over the Constitution as much as the president is given extraordinary constitutional powers in general.
In the case of my paper, it was more congressional legislation trying to suppress certain things that were fears that were heightened during the war. But so it wasn't necessarily the president. But in my opinion, no, it should not be expanded. The Constitution should be pretty steady, and should be the defining factor in lawmaking and decisions throughout history. Shouldn't be biased towards what state our country is in.
Any other questions? Oh, Dr. Bauer.
Hi, you guys all gave really awesome and interesting papers, so thank you. That was interesting. My question's for Anthony in particular. My pleasure to see two of the four of you guys talking about espionage. I've actually always been curious about the Espionage and Sedition Act itself, and it seems, I don't know how much you dug beyond your particular case, but even today, that act is used for really broad attempts to target speech. And so I guess a question I had, if in your research, if you came across any thinking by Holmes or others about the logic of combining espionage and sedition in the same act, because the way I always view it in my studies is that those are actually quite different things, right? So it's one thing to be an anarchist and saying you don't believe in government. It's another thing to be a spy. And it's, I think, problematic that still today people are being tried under this 1917 act, espionage and sedition, when they're clearly not practicing espionage. So I'm curious, in one of the earliest interpretations, if that issue ever came up.
I think there was a distinction, but I don't know the clear-cut thought behind them. But there's a distinction, but it's not a very clear and defined cut. So sorry, I don't know much more.
I haven't found it either, so I didn't know if Holmes talked about it.
David Schuster, History Department. Thanks for the four presentations. I think they're great. And yeah, we have 3 court cases and 1 of community action. My question, I guess, is more focused towards the court cases, although maybe the community action might have a place in it. Anthony, you start by talking about Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's well known for being a pragmatic jurist. And with that idea of pragmatism, we Americans love pragmatism. It is what we consider our big philosophical contribution to the world. And typically pragmatism is seen as trying to balance principle with reality, smooth operations. For those of you that talked about the court cases, and maybe even the Love Canal as well, to what extent did you see conflict between a principle and smooth operation? Were the outcomes mainly just basically trying to come up with a legal decision that would lead to smooth operations afterwards? Or did you find that the decisions that you were focusing on were based mainly on principle?
Holmes was very influenced by the philosophies in his early education. So he took that into consideration, but he tried to use the Constitution as a guide, as a guiding light, so to speak, and then depending on, as the paper says, he was willing to very liberally interpret the Constitution depending on what state the country was in and how they were what people were wanting to do with the direction of the country. So it wasn't. He tried to balance those in the best way he could.
I think you see it a lot in Griswold v. Connecticut, just because there's obviously one majority opinion, but there's also 3 concurring opinions that all say pretty much they all come to the same conclusion that there's a right to marital privacy, but they all derive them from different amendments, which is kind of weird. And also the fact that they talk about penumbras and emanations, there was no Supreme Court case that talked about this kind of stuff. So they kind of bring in a lot of new legal concepts in order to get to the conclusion they want. While Justice Black and Stewart were more well, like, I don't want this thing to be the case, but the law doesn't say it, so we're not going to do it. So I think you see the majority being more practical, while Black and Stewart being more like for principles.
I would say in my case, it's actually both. I would say that there was a practical measure that was applied simply in this case that Jaworski requested the Supreme Court hear the case in May, and by July, the Supreme Court was hearing the case, which is a pretty quick turnaround for a request by the Supreme Court, and that probably speaks towards their knowledge and acknowledgement that it was really important to get this case settled as quickly as possible. The country had already been suffering through this scandal for over a year, and there was no need to delay it any further, so it would be impractical to do so. And I would say that the argument of the court, which was unanimously decided, was based upon principle. They looked at previous precedent set by the court, as well as the Constitution itself, to understand the idea of executive privilege. And what they decided was based in the language of the Constitution itself. So I would say it was a very constitutionalist approach to the problem, but it was also done in a way that was practical and helped resolve the issue as quickly as possible.
I think for Love Canal that they eventually were trying to find a solution to the problem, but it was such a unique, nothing had ever happened like this before, so how are they supposed to just, take 810 families and relocate them somewhere? What do they do? They didn't even know the depth of it. So I think that, at first it was obvious that they were slow to tending to what they were going to do with it, but I honestly just think it was just, they had no idea how to approach it. So looking back at it, I think they were trying to find, and they eventually did, but it shouldn't have taken the time span that it did.
Actually, this is building off of Professor Schuster's question, this dichotomy between practical and principle. I was actually wondering about reality and ideal, because the title of this panel is America, a Work in Progress. And all of your papers in some way, shape, or form deal with the reality of America running up against the ideal of what America should be. And I was just wondering if any of the activists or if any of the lawyers invoked this idea of this is what America should do, or this is how Americans should act, with the First Amendment or with contraception. This is what American marriage should be. This is what the American presidency should be. This is what America should give to our families. This is what we should safeguard for the people who are citizens of our country. Did you run into any? And this is a very big question, I understand, so I'm probably going way above, but all of your papers kind of sparked in me the idea of we're obviously dealing with cracks in the edifice of our national kind of character. So the question is, what were the aspirations that were invoked in order to make their arguments? If you can answer.
I can speak to my thing. I guess you see in mine this idea of the idea of sexual and social purity really becoming popular after the Civil War. Anthony Comstock, for example, was big into the abolitionist movement, and some of my authors talked about how a lot of these people, after slavery was abolished, they desired a new cause to champion, and this new cause was sexual and social purity. So in that way, you see people thinking America should be good and moral, and this is how to do that.
I would say for my case, there were definitely some ideals being pushed, and they were definitely combative. I would say, at least in the case of all of the people that were trying to have the tapes released, their ideal that they were pushing was justice. They wanted to find out what had happened and then be able to proceed accordingly. And at the time, Nixon was basically pushing the ideal of presidential supremacy. His abuse of power is understood today, but at the time, it was really a question of a presidency that had been spiraling upwards in power as it is, the idea of the imperial presidency, and Nixon was perhaps the definition of the imperial presidency. So in that way, there was definitely an ideal over both justice and what our president should be allowed to do, or expected to do in cases when, he thinks he's above the law. So I would say there were definitely some important ideals being tackled, though I don't know. I mean, aside from the prosecution and the Congress's desire to find the truth and deal out justice, I don't know whether there's any other ideal involved. It's just it was their job, and that was what they did.
I think for Love Canal, it wasn't really that they were based on what the United States should do. They was more just they saw the how immoral it was, and that when they put up the barbed wire fence saying unauthorized personnel, keep out, danger. It's they were trying to protect everyone else besides the people that were inside who were actually in danger. And it's they have these clear incidences of people like the Michael Gibbs, who I talked about, having all these unexplainable diseases, more than one, and everyone having all these similar experiences, and they just didn't even, at first, they didn't take it seriously at all. It's not just a coincidence, it has to be something. There's clear evidence that this is what happened there.
With Holmes, he was an idealistic person and tried to, but he wouldn't push his agenda when interpreting cases. He had to use the Constitution and weave it as he could through his opinions, even if he had to pull threads from the Constitution, but to put the idealism into it. But other than that, the Constitution was firmly set.
My question's probably mostly for Michael. By the time Watergate was finished, I was about 14. And with the leaving of Agnew, Nixon retiring, and then Ford pardoning him with the Supreme Court justice that recused himself, I've always thought there was a larger deep state conspiracy in play. And I was wondering if any of your research maybe exhibited potentially only rabbit trails, but brought some things that would cause you to think maybe I need to dig a little bit deeper to see if some of that kind of thing was going on.
So, irony of ironies, I actually learned about the Watergate scandal in a class called Scandals and Conspiracy Theories last year. And I cannot take any credit for the conclusion I'm going to give you because I've already been explained the reality. And my answer is that there is no evidence of some deeper state than the dirty tricks and the plumbers that were, I didn't have a chance to actually, I had to take that out, but Nixon had a group that that were called the plumbers, and they themselves were what you might call a conspiratorial group, but they were not a deep state. They were all rooted out throughout the scandal, and eventually, the indictment was actually mostly against a lot of the members of the plumbers. So I would say, if anything, the efforts by the government, the larger government, the executive aside, was proof that there wasn't a deep state, because if a deep state had existed, you would think that they probably would have gone through better efforts to help the president cover up what had happened. So that's my basic conclusion on that, I guess.
I'll get to you. Should have just stayed next to Kyle.
Excuse me. My question is for Anthony and Anthony and Michael. With today's political setting that we have currently, how do you feel that your topics engage and set possibly precedent as far as executive privilege or free speech when we're being told that the enemy of the news is the enemy of the state? I mean, we have a president that goes on TV and states that. How do you feel your law, the rulings you guys looked at contribute to today's and can be pertinent to now as they were back then?
With this precedent, I think the precedent that Holmes says is pretty definitive that unless you're going to incite violence in a drastic sense, like if it's an imminent danger, but like as shouting fire in a theater, unless those type of things are going to happen, speech is fully free in other capacities. So I think that's the precedent Holmes would continue with.
As far as my case goes, I actually became interested in researching this Supreme Court case last year during what you may remember. There was the fallout from the Comey hearing, and there was all kinds of questions about whether or not Trump had any secret recordings, and there were some questions of his ability to invoke executive privilege in order to keep whatever he wanted secret. So that was actually one of the reasons why I was interested in this topic and writing this paper. And I would say that the case is extremely important to the political atmosphere today. I don't know that necessarily this specific precedent is applicable to anything that may eventually be brought up to the Supreme Court, but I think that it's important because it shows that the executive is not supreme and that they cannot dictate to the other branches of government what they will or will not do or what they will or will not inform them of. So in that way, I think it's extremely important.
Okay, so I think that's, do our panelists have any questions for each other?
Michael, I was actually wondering why Rehnquist recused himself.
The specific detail is not, I don't remember exactly, but I do know it was because earlier in Rehnquist's career, he had done some work with Nixon in a legislative setting. I don't recall. I'm thinking it had something to do with Nixon during his time in Congress, and at that time, Rehnquist was probably working in a lower court or doing something, and because of that, there was a conflict of interest. So Rehnquist recused himself.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This is a wonderful panel.